Okay guys, this is going to be kind of a long video on the features of the skull, the bones of the cranial vault, and the bones of the face. So we're going to start out by looking at the sutures. And the suture that runs horizontally over the top of the skull here is called the coronal suture. The suture that runs this direction is called the sagittal suture. And if you lift up the skull, you can see the sagittal suture splits on the back, kind of like an upside down Y, and the part that goes around the bottom of the Y is called the lambdoid or lambdoidal suture. Okay, and then finally the last suture is here on the side. You can kind of see this crack that is running up over where the ear would be. That is the squamous or squamous suture. The other feature on that part of your list is the orbit, and I just want to remind you that the orbit is the eye socket. Okay, so those are the sutures and the orbits. So now we're going to start with our first actual cranial bone. So this cranial bone here is the frontal bone, and it goes from here at the bridge of the nose all the way up and stops here at the coronal suture. Okay, the only feature you're responsible for knowing on that bone is right here in the eye socket. It's this little part here. This would be called the supraorbital notch. Now this one is a notch because the bottom is open. If it was an entire hole and this had a little bridge across it, you would call it the supraorbital foramen. Okay, the next bones we're going to cover are the parietal bone. So let's turn the skull back around. You see again where the coronal suture meets the sagittal suture. And these two large bones that are on the top and sides of the skull are the two parietal bones. And there are no features that you're responsible for knowing for those bones. Now we're going to continue down to the back. This is going to be the occipital bone. So I'm going to show you that occipital bone starts here at the lambdoidal suture and goes across the back of the skull and then down around the bottom. And it stops right after this large hole. This large hole, I'm going to flip the skull over so we can see it this direction. This large hole is actually called the foramen magnum, which is Latin for big hole. Pretty simple, huh? Okay, on the edge of the hole there are these two rounded knobs, and they are going to sit in the superior articular facets of the atlas bone. So this one and that one are going to be called the occipital condyles. So again, this knob here and this knob here are the occipital condyles. The last feature you have to know of the occipital bone is actually a hole that goes through the condyle, not behind it. Behind it up here we have this big jugular foramen. The hole that goes through the condyles, if you can see it right in here, is called the hypoglossal canal, and there's one inside each of the occipital condyles, there and there. So those are the feature of the occipital bone. Now, the next bone is the temporal bone, and its border is the squamous suture right over here where this clasp is, and down here to the front, it has this small bridge-like structure here. Okay, the temporal bone. So that is the squamous or squamous suture. The entire outer flat section of this bone is called the squamous or squamous part. Okay, and then we're going to start with this little bridge. This piece is reaching towards the zygomatic bone. So this is called the zygomatic process of the temporal bone. Okay, now just for fun, this is the zygomatic bone, and this is the temporal process of the zygomatic bone because it's reaching for this temporal bone. Together, both of these processes, the zygomatic process of the temporal bone and the temporal process of the zygomatic bone, make this entire part right here, which is called the zygomatic arch. Okay. Behind the zygomatic process, right in here, you see this is where the mandible makes contact with the skull. And so this little cup, I'm going to go ahead and pull the mandible off so you can see this little bowl shape right here is named for the bone that goes in there. So since it's the mandible, we're going to call that the mandibular fossa. Right behind the mandibular fossa is another hole. This is a dead end hole in the skull right here. And this is called my external acoustic meatus. Behind that is this large lumpy structure. This is the mastoid process of the temporal bone. And then finally, this little pointy one right here is called the styloid process. Those are all the features we can see on the external temporal bone. To see the rest of the features, I need to turn it back around onto its top. I need to lift off the skull cap. That means I'm going to have to unhook it on both sides. Okay, lift off the skull cap. Oh, sorry, taking 2 hands. There we go. Okay, now we are inside the skull. And so this is the inside of the squamous part of the temporal bone. And then this rocky ridge right here, this part is called the petrous part. Petrous means rock-like. Okay, so I told you in lab it was kind of like a big letter L. So the squamous part would be my index finger and the petrous part would be my thumb. You can see how they kind of line up there. Okay, now there are several holes around the petrous part and in the petrous part that we need to identify. One of them I've already given you a head start on. This large hole here that is not through the occipital condyle but just behind it is the jugular foramen. Okay, just above that, near the top of the rocky ridge, is another dead end hole. This is the internal acoustic meatus. And if I come around the other side on the front of the petrous part, this is the only hole that my stick will actually go in, like that. That is called the carotid canal. Okay, so those are the features of the temporal bone. Next, we have the sphenoid bone. Now, the sphenoid bone edge is up here. I called these the fangs in lab, here and here. And it goes up here, and it goes down and meets that petrous part of the temporal bone. So again, we have several features we need to know. The most prominent feature is this bony cup right here. The entire cup is called the sella turcica. The bottom surface of the cup right here where the pituitary sits, since the pituitary is also called the hypophysis, the name of this part of the inside of the cup is the hypophyseal fossa. All right, now we're going to name some holes. The names are going to have foramen in front of them instead of behind them. So here, we're going to name them by shape. Here is the foramen ovale. Here is the foramen spinosum. I kind of have to lean it up a little bit or turn it around. Right here under the fang is the foramen rotundum. And then right here immediately that kind of runs into the carotid canal is the foramen lacerum or lacerum, however you want to say it to make sure you spell it correctly. Okay, we just have a couple more holes here. We have a big boomerang-shaped crack underneath. Whoops, my thumb is in the way. Let me move that. Boomerang-shaped crack underneath the fang. Okay, right under here. Now, if I turn the skull around forward and move that mandible, you'll see that that boomerang-shaped hole is actually at the back of the eye socket, and it is called the superior orbital fissure. Fissure means crack. So I'm going to put the stick through that fissure and I'm going to turn it around so you can actually see where it is coming through on this side. So it's just above the foramen rotundum. Then, when looking at the eye socket, medial to the boomerang-shaped hole is another little round hole right there. That goes to the hole that comes out at the tops of the fangs, here and here. Whoops, sorry. Here and here. Those are the optic canals, and the 2 optic nerves will come out through those holes and crisscross right over the pituitary gland, and that structure is going to be called the optic chiasm. All right, I'm just checking the list to make sure we got all of those so far. Okay, the last bone of the cranial vault, we can kind of only see the top of it peeking out and the bottom. So the top of it, the bone is the ethmoid bone, and the top of it is just this little section right here. This part, I called it the shark fin that is sticking most up towards you. It's called the crista galli. And then around the crista galli are these 2 areas that have holes in them. They are called the Cribriform Plate. Now, this piece continues all the way vertically through this bone, and this bone is actually located right here between the eyes and the nose region, and that piece that was the crista galli continues all the way through and comes down into the interior of the nose, and we call that one the perpendicular plate. So let me lower my camera here and show you with the pointer This upper section, the divider of the right and left side of the nasal passages, is my perpendicular plate of the ethmoid. Now I'm stopping here because this bone coming back out at us is a facial bone called the vomer, where we're going to go over in the next video. Okay, so those are the bones and features of the cranial vault, the cranial bones.